Before the Gospels were written, how do we know the eyewitness testimony about Jesus was reliably preserved by oral tradition? And no doubt you might be skeptical. Can we really trust that memory could preserve truth over a few decades? Or how do we know the stories about Jesus weren't changed as they pass from one person to another? Akin to how the original message gets lost in translation as kids play the telephone game. But this popular doubt commits the logical fallacy of a faulty analogy, as the telephone game has specific rules that are in no way analogous to how oral tradition was preserved amongst the early Christians. Here are the rules for the telephone game. One person starts with the original message, usually some benign sentence with no real significance. They then whisper it to the next person in the chain so that no one else can hear. That person, even if they did hear it correctly, has the option to throw in a little spice and alter the story, trying to boost the comedy value as it passes down the line. With each retelling of the story, it goes rogue until the final link of the chain shares out loud what they were told. By now, no doubt a crazy sentence baptized with toilet humor. And so everyone laughs. Now, critiques of memory and oral tradition, they're not much different. Bart Ehrman, for instance, points to studies calling into question the general reliability of memory, as well as the tendency in oral cultures for uncontrolled stories to change over generations of retelling. But let me give you 5 reasons why, in the case of Christianity, both the telephone game and this scholarly critique entirely miss the mark. First, as foreign as it may seem in our digital age, where search engines and storage technology have sparked the death of memorization, teachers in the ancient world, they leaned on memory as a vital muscle that could be reliably trained. Scholars note how, amazingly, Greek actors of this period were able to perform the entirety of Homer's Iliad or Odyssey from memory. And the Talmud, it often speaks of Jewish students having trained memories able to achieve remarkable feats. Craig Evans writes, "We have numerous rabbinic stories of prodigious memories, of rabbis who could recite whole books of scripture or vast amounts of oral tradition." Remember, unlike the telephone game, Jesus' disciples would have heard their itinerant rabbi repeat his teachings from one town to the next. And scholars note how Jesus' parables and sermons employ a range of devices designed to aid memory. So there is every reason to think that Jesus' apostles could reliably commit to memory the contents that now make up our Gospels. Second, while Ehrman's studies might show that memory is generally unreliable, specific conditions significantly heighten our preservation of the truth. For example, suppose at the start of the telephone game, you told these kids that if the last person repeats verbatim the original message, every single kid along the line will be awarded $1,000. Do you think such a potent motivator would make a difference? Absolutely. Whereas before these kids were careless with the truth, perhaps even cheekily incentivized to go rogue, now they have an overwhelming motivation to reliably preserve the truth. And the same is true of the early Christians. This high-stakes motivation is precisely what we see expressed by the apostles and their companions, like Paul in 2 Corinthians 4, Luke in his gospel introduction, or John in the opening of his first epistle, all of whom commit to reliably relaying the truth of what they had seen and heard. Since Jesus' teaching and atonement, they carry eternal implications. Not to mention the fact that certain major events we have emotional connections to actually get better etched into our memory. Even though it happened well over a decade ago, I can still recount dozens of details from my wedding day. Where we were, who was present, what was said, and that's without having to recall or share these memories often at all. So do you think Jesus walking on water or raising Lazarus from the dead or going supernova at his transfiguration might leave a lasting impression on the disciples, being forever etched into their memory? I think there's good reason to believe so. Which leads to third, the apostles' memory was kept fresh and alive through constant retelling. Whereas in the telephone game, you only get to hear the message once, the apostles, they would have been constantly recounting their stories about Jesus. That meant not only did the early Christian communities hear them repeatedly, aiding memorization, but it meant that the details never dimmed in the apostles' own mind across the 20 to 60 year gap from when these events of Jesus' life happened and their written record in the Gospels. Day after day, these memories were kept alive and fresh, the same way stories I regularly retell in my own teaching are vividly alive in my memory. Fourth, another disanalogy between the telephone game and the pre-gospel oral tradition is that the apostles didn't just whisper to one person. They taught publicly. Acts 2:42 describes the early Christian community devoting themselves to the apostles' teaching, a formal reference to the art of memorization and putting into practice these words of the Lord. This communal setting of learning put controls on the apostolic traditions, meaning if someone made a mistake in their retelling of Jesus' life and teaching, they could be corrected quickly by this community's motivation to preserve the truth. But that communal preservation of the apostolic oral traditions, it pales in comparison to my fifth and final point, that some apostles were still alive when the Gospels were written, to serve as custodians over the content. Unlike the telephone game, where the original message passes through a large number of different people before it arrives at the end, with no mechanism of quality control built in the case of early Christianity, the apostles were still around and able to guard the veracity of these oral traditions as they were finally penned. Traditional authorship of the Gospels, for which there is an excellent academic case. It states that Mark was Peter's interpreter, reliably recording the contents of his apostolic preaching in Rome. Matthew, aka Levi the tax collector, was an apostle and eyewitness of Jesus. Luke was a medical doctor and traveling companion of Paul, who carefully investigated everything from eyewitness sources, perhaps while Paul was incarcerated in Jerusalem, and then wrote an orderly account of Jesus' life. And that John was the last living apostle, the son of Zebedee and beloved disciple, who composed his own eyewitness account. The fact that these original eyewitnesses were still alive at the writing of these Gospels to stamp the oral traditions as true is an enormously significant fact. This is what scholars of oral tradition call controlled stories, as opposed to uncontrolled stories that morph over time. The apostles weren't just telling one person at the beginning of the line, they were telling everyone along the line, and ensuring what was finally written down reliably reflected the original story. So given these 5 specific features, the telephone game is an obvious faulty analogy of the pre-gospel period of early Christianity. This is further ratified by the compelling case for the historical reliability and eyewitness status of the contents of our 4 canonical Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. A case I'd invite you to explore in other videos on the reliability of the New Testament on this channel. Truth invites questioning. The bottom line is, you don't need to worry about whether we have the original apostolic message preserved in the Gospels. All the evidence suggests yes. The question is, what will you do with that apostolic message? Hey, I hope you found this video on oral tradition helpful as part of our series on the reliability of the New Testament. I'm Dan Patterson, and here at Questioning Christianity, we have hundreds of these videos helping you connect the Christian story to life's deepest questions. We explore theology, history, philosophy, and apologetics. If you haven't subscribed yet, we'll wait. Seriously, do it now. And if you want to help us reach more people, then share away to anyone you think this will help. As always, truth invites questioning. See you next time.